CEO addicts her. After a one-night stand with his contract wife, he asks for kisses every day. My dear YouTube family and friends, I hope all of you are doing well and in good health. Your well-being brings peace and joy to my heart. I kindly request you to share in the comments where you are listening to this story from. The wonderful feedback you gave on the last story filled my heart with deep peace and happiness. I read each of your comments with love, and I always try my best to reply to every one of them. May God bless you with endless happiness and keep you safe and protected. Now, let's begin today's story. The air inside Sinclair Enterprises was thick with tension as Isla Carter sat across from Adrian Sinclair, the ruthless billionaire whose name commanded fear and respect in the business world. His piercing blue eyes studied her with unreadable intensity, his chiseled jaw tight as he slid the contract across the desk toward her. Isla took a steadying breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the pen. This was it, a business deal disguised as marriage, an arrangement that would benefit them both. He needed a wife to secure his empire's image, and she needed financial stability to pay for her mother's medical treatments. You understand the terms, Miss Carter? Adrian's voice was deep, smooth, yet laced with cold detachment. She nodded, her emerald green eyes locking onto his. Yes, 1 year, no intimacy, just a marriage for appearances. Adrian's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze flickering with something unreadable before he gave a curt nod. Good. He watched as she signed her name, sealing her fate with a stroke of ink. The moment the pen left the paper, Isla felt the weight of the contract settle over her like invisible chains. She had just agreed to be the wife of a man who had built his fortune on ruthless business tactics, a man known for his icy demeanor and lack of emotional attachments. Yet, as she glanced up at him, something in his eyes sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. The wedding was an elaborate affair, filled with high society's most powerful elites, all eager to witness the union of Adrian Sinclair and his new wife. Isla played her role perfectly, smiling on cue, posing for photographs, and allowing Adrian's arm to rest possessively around her waist. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, an untouchable power duo destined for greatness. But behind closed doors, their marriage was anything but real. Their home was a mansion of cold marble and pristine perfection, yet it lacked warmth, just like the man who owned it. Adrian was distant, treating her more like a business partner than a wife. They barely spoke beyond what was necessary, their interactions confined to public appearances and formalities. Isla told herself this was exactly what she had signed up for. No feelings, no expectations. And yet she couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened whenever Adrian entered the room, the way his presence seemed to command the air around him, making it impossible to breathe. Days turned into weeks, and though their agreement remained unbroken, something between them had begun to shift. It was in the way Adrian's gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way his fingers would brush against hers when they passed each other in the hallway. A tension built between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Isla tried to ignore it, tried to remind herself that this was nothing more than a contract, but her body betrayed her whenever he was near. Then came the night that changed everything. It had been raining, the storm outside matching the turmoil brewing inside her chest. Isla had spent the entire day at the hospital with her mother, watching helplessly as the woman who had raised her grew weaker. By the time she returned home, exhaustion clung to her bones. She curled up on the living room couch, staring at the fire, trying to shake off the overwhelming emotions threatening to consume her. She hadn't heard Adrian come in until his deep voice broke the silence. "You're still awake." She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his suit jacket draped over his arm, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. There was something different about him tonight, something softer, though his expression remained unreadable. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian poured himself a drink, but instead of heading to his office as he usually did, he walked over and sat beside her. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something dangerous. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Isla nodded, staring at the fire. "My mother. The doctors aren't sure how much longer she has." Her voice wavered, and she hated the vulnerability that slipped through. Adrian didn't respond immediately, but when he finally spoke, his voice was firm. "She will get the best care. You don't have to worry about that." Isla exhaled shakily. "Thank you." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't the comfortable kind. It was charged, heavy, and for the first time since their wedding, Isla allowed herself to really look at him. He was devastatingly handsome, his sharp features illuminated by the firelight, his intense gaze fixed on her in a way that made her stomach twist. Without thinking, she whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Adrian's brow furrowed slightly. "Doing what?" "Helping me. Marrying me. You could have chosen anyone." He studied her for a long moment, and then, as if something inside him snapped, he reached for her. His lips crashed against hers, hot and demanding, stealing the breath from her lungs. Isla gasped against his mouth, but instead of pulling away, she found herself leaning into him, her fingers gripping his shirt as heat spread through her like wildfire. The kiss was nothing like she had imagined, not controlled or calculated, but raw and desperate, filled with a hunger neither of them had acknowledged until now. Adrian's hands slid around her waist, pulling her onto his lap, his grip possessive as he deepened the kiss. She felt the tension in his body, the restraint he had been holding onto for so long breaking all at once. Her heart pounded as his lips moved against hers, claiming her in a way that left no room for doubt. This wasn't about the contract anymore. This was something else, something neither of them could control. When they finally broke apart, their breaths mingling in the heated space between them, Adrian's forehead rested against hers. "Isla." His voice was rough, filled with something she had never heard from him before. She should have said something, should have reminded him that this was all just a business arrangement, but the words never came, because, in that moment, with his hands still holding her close, with the taste of his kiss lingering on her lips, she wasn't sure she wanted to pretend anymore, and the way Adrian looked at her, as if she was the only thing in the world that mattered, told her he didn't either. The contract had been clear, no intimacy, no emotions, no love. But with one reckless kiss, they had shattered every rule they had sworn to uphold. And now, there was no turning back. The first rays of dawn filtered through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft golden glow across the bedroom. Adrian Sinclair stirred, feeling an unfamiliar warmth beside him. His sharp blue eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim morning light, and as his gaze shifted, he found himself staring at Isla Carter, his contract wife, still fast asleep. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply watched her, his breath slow and measured, his mind still tangled in the events of the previous night. Her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, her long lashes resting against her fair skin, her slightly parted lips tempting him more than they should. Strands of her wavy chestnut hair were spread across the pillow, a few curling over her bare shoulder, and the sight made something tighten in his chest. He had never truly looked at her before, not like this, not with the quiet reverence that was creeping into his system like an intoxicating drug. Adrian was a man used to control. He thrived on structure, on discipline, on keeping emotions at bay. His entire empire was built on the foundation that nothing, no one, could shake his focus. And yet, as he lay beside Isla, taking in the soft glow of her skin, the relaxed expression on her face, he realized something unnerving. He didn't feel empty. For as long as he could remember, he had woken up with an unbearable hollowness in his chest, as if every achievement, every victory, every million-dollar deal meant nothing once the day ended. He had accepted it as part of who he was, a man destined for power, but not for warmth. But now, for the first time, the emptiness wasn't there. Instead, there was a quiet contentment, a dangerous sense of peace that he didn't know how to handle. His gaze traced the curve of Isla's lips, the way her fingers rested lightly against the sheets, her body relaxed in sleep. He should get up. He should leave before she woke up, before she looked at him with those deep emerald eyes and shattered whatever illusion of control he had left. And yet he stayed. The events of the night before played in his mind like a vivid dream, the storm raging outside, the crackling fire, the way her lips had felt against his, warm and eager, as if she had been waiting for that moment as much as he had. He hadn't meant to kiss her. He hadn't meant to break the unspoken barrier between them. But once he had, there had been no stopping what came next. Their bodies had moved in sync, an unstoppable force of longing and heat that neither of them had been able to resist. And now, in the aftermath, Adrian felt something shift inside him, something he wasn't sure he wanted to name. His fingers twitched as if fighting the urge to reach out, to touch the smooth skin of her arm, to run his hand over the curve of her waist. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still. He was Adrian Sinclair, the man who made deals without emotion, who married Isla under a contract, not for love. And yet, the way his heart was thudding in his chest told him that last night had changed something. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew one thing. He didn't want to ignore it. A soft sigh escaped Isla's lips as she shifted slightly, her body pressing closer to his unconsciously. Adrian held his breath, watching as her lashes fluttered before her emerald eyes finally opened, still hazy with sleep. For a brief moment, she didn't seem to register where she was. Then, as her gaze met his, realization dawned. Her entire body stiffened, and in an instant, she was pulling the sheets up, sitting up straighter, putting distance between them. "Adrian!" Her voice was hoarse from sleep, and something about it made his stomach tighten. "Last night, we shouldn't have... She trailed off, her gaze darting away as if she couldn't bear to look at him. Adrian studied her, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt something hot and irritated rise in his chest. He didn't like that look on her face. Regret. He didn't like the way she was already trying to dismiss what had happened between them, as if it had been some meaningless accident. His jaw tightened. No, it hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a mistake. Before she could speak again, Adrian reached out, his fingers gently but firmly grasping her chin, tilting her face back toward him. Isla's breath hitched, her eyes widening as she was forced to look at him. His gaze was piercing, filled with something she couldn't quite decipher. "Kiss me." His voice was low, commanding, leaving no room for argument. Isla's lips parted in shock. "What?" Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she searched his face, looking for some sign that he was teasing, but she found none. Adrian's grip on her chin remained firm, his blue eyes dark with intensity. "Kiss me," he repeated, slower this time, as if testing her reaction. Isla's breath came in uneven pulls, her mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had agreed to a marriage without intimacy, without emotions, without anything beyond appearances, and yet here he was, demanding something from her that went against every rule they had set. Her body burned at the memory of his lips on hers, the way he had held her as if she was the only thing that mattered. And now he was asking for it again. She should say no. She should push him away, remind him of their agreement, remind herself of the walls she had built to keep her heart safe. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized something that shook her to the core. He wasn't just demanding a kiss. He was asking for more. Adrian Sinclair, the man who had always been distant and untouchable, was looking at her as if she was the only thing grounding him, as if he needed her, and God help her, but she didn't want to deny him. Without another thought, she leaned in, closing the distance between them, her lips brushing against his with a hesitation that was quickly overtaken by something deeper. Adrian didn't wait. He cupped her face, pulling her in, his lips claiming hers in a kiss that was slower this time, but just as intense. It wasn't like the night before, filled with desperation and heat. This was different. It was deliberate, possessive, as if he was trying to tell her something without words. When they finally pulled apart, Isla was breathless, her hands gripping his shoulders for support. Adrian's thumb traced her lower lip, his gaze locked onto hers. "You're mine," he murmured, his voice like silk and steel. And in that moment, Isla knew. Last night had changed everything. And there was no going back. The change in Adrian Sinclair was subtle at first, barely noticeable in the grand scheme of their arrangement. But as the days passed, Isla Carter couldn't ignore the way he had begun to claim her in ways that went beyond their contract. It started with a kiss in the morning, a slow, lingering press of his lips against hers before he left for work. The first time it happened, she had been too stunned to react. She had still been in bed, her hair tousled from sleep, barely awake when Adrian leaned down, cupped her face, and kissed her. Not a casual peck, not an obligatory gesture, but something deeper, something that made her entire body heat with awareness. He hadn't said anything afterward, just brushed his thumb over her cheek and walked out of the bedroom as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Isla had sat there, breathless, her fingers trembling as she touched her lips, wondering what the hell had just happened. But it didn't stop there. Every morning after that, Adrian kissed her before leaving. Sometimes it was slow and teasing, as if daring her to stop him. Other times, it was firm and possessive, as if